What's up, guys? This is TheKephas. Today we're going to check out the macros that I've created for Devastation Evokers starting out in the War Within. Now, Devastation Evokers still being the newest class, Evokers in general being the newest class, they're still somewhat underdeveloped, and there are still fewer abilities than what most other classes have. In spite of that, though, it's still one of the most difficult classes to make a sequence for. So you'll understand what I mean when we get there, but let's go ahead and take a look at the talent tree that I'm currently using. There honestly isn't a lot to talk about here because, pretty much all the abilities in this tree, most of them you're going to take by default because they're just essential. And then you have some things that are, you have a couple choices. Most of what you're going to pick is just going to empower things. So there's nothing that's really going to change up how the macros work, but there are a couple things to go over. So the left side is almost all utility. It doesn't matter what you pick. Pretty much everything is stuff that you're going to manage in the right situation. You're not going to put it in a sequence at all. You're just going to use it accordingly. There's a lot of, support abilities that evokers have, which are really nice, but you're obviously not going to, they're not going to be part of your core rotation. The only exception, I guess, is Tip the Scales, which has a longer cooldown, which is off the global cooldown, which we will be using that one on cooldown, and so that will be in the sequence. But in general, it doesn't matter what you take on this side at all. It's just going to be whatever utility you want. The right side is what really matters, and still, there really aren't a lot of choices. I mean, there are some, but you kind of basically have two main, choices. You can either go with a Firestorm, style build that will change up your rotation a bit, or you can do what I did and do Shattering Star, which I feel is a lot easier to do with a macro, and it also tends to be more reliable as well. This build that I've taken is pretty much directly from Wowhead, so that's what I'm going with. But otherwise, it's just a lot of stuff that's going to enhance other abilities, improve your regenerations, and just different things like that. Obviously, we've added in the Pyre, of course, Eternity Surge, Dragon Rage, those things that we're obviously going to take, and pretty much everything else is pretty self-explanatory. So this is the build that I'm currently running with, and it's just pretty straightforward and isn't really going to change too much how the Devastation Evoker actually plays. So with that being said, let's go ahead and take a look at the actual macros themselves. We have two macros, one for single target and one for AoE. Now I want to get this out of the way first. We have two macros, and yet I'm saying this is a 5-button play style that I'm running. I have to use 5 buttons even though I only have 2 macros, and that's because 3 of those 5 buttons are unique. You've got Deep Breath, which is a ground targeting ability that has a very unique type of ground targeting that you really can't macro. There's no way you could really get that to work inside of a gnome sequence or macro regardless. So that's one that's going to have to be managed separately. Fortunately, that one has a longer cooldown. But then you have 2 empowerment abilities. You have Eternity Surge, which we take in the talent tree, and you also have Fire Breath. And those abilities are unique. There are no other abilities in the game that function like those, and the ones that the Evoker has. I guess each spec has some, but no other class has abilities like that. And they're pretty fun to use, but they're pretty much impossible to macro and have it work reliably. Not to mention, you kind of want to control, depending on the situation, what empowerment level you use those abilities at. So point being, you just have to manage them on a separate button. So those 2 abilities, which are part of your core rotation, unfortunately, are going to have to be managed separately. I personally use a weak aura to track them, so that way I know when they're ready. But again, that does for 2 reasons. One, they're really hard to macro well and get it to work, and 2, it gives you more control over what empowerment level you use them at anyway. So either way, it's just, in my opinion, best to manage them on a separate button. So that's 3 of your 5 buttons. Fortunately, your 2 other buttons are going to manage everything else, and you have a single target macro and you have an AoE macro. So let's go ahead and take a look at that single target macro first. Okay, so we have a priority loop. This is a reverse priority loop, and everything in this loop, the macro is going to try to use more than anything that's on the outside. We have a repeat of 4. This is a very unique macro that I've made, kind of. I mean, it kind of is based on, like, if you watch any of my other macros, I don't usually make them like this. I've had to just really experiment and mess around with stuff. I've leveled up a couple of evokers now and spent some time on the target dummy, ran a couple dungeons, did a lot of the, the Radiant Echoes event and as much of that as I can. So I've tried my best to try these out and see what works best. And so the biggest challenge is the filler abilities, and so we'll look into that as we get through this. So this is a reverse priority, so the macro is going to follow a pattern of the top ability is the most important, but it's going to try to move down through each ability that's in this priority loop. Okay, so the top ability here is our essence spender and our, also our procs when we get free usages. We want to try to make sure that we are using disintegrate as much as possible so that we are not overcapping our essences and that we are also, spending our essence burst charges as well. So that's obviously going to be the most important thing that we do. Next up, we have our shattering star in here, which has a little bit of a longer cooldown, but we're throwing it in here because we're going to use it pretty often, and that also adds a buffer for the problematic ability in this macro, and that ability is Living Flame. So this is where the real challenge comes in. Everything that I've tried to do to get this to work, because the evoker has so few abilities, is trying to get Living Flame to go off enough that the macro is not hanging on abilities that it can't use and you're just sitting there, but also not having Living Flame be used too much and overtake the entire macro and you're not using those other abilities when they actually should be used. This is the balancing act and the challenge I have with every single caster class that I try to make sequences for. It's always the challenge trying not to overuse or underuse that filler ability, and it's very difficult to find that balance. Each class I have to spend time messing around with different methods to work. Because the evoker has so few abilities, it's a little bit more tricky, but I feel like I've gotten down something that works. My idea here is that it's pretty straightforward, actually. The easiest method and the most, generally the most obvious method is working the best, which usually doesn't, but because the evoker has so few abilities, it actually does just work pretty well. So what it does is, because this is a reverse priority, it's going to use 1 and then 2, 1, and then 3, 2, 1. So what that means is that it's going to try to use Disintegrate a lot, and then it's going to try to use Shattering Star a little bit less often than Disintegrate, but more often than Living Flame. So in this way, like the way I have this, Disintegrate with this pattern is going to try to be used 3 times each loop, whereas Living Flame is only going to try to be used 1 time each loop. That's basically how this is going to work. And so that way, you're giving more chance for Disintegrate to be used over Living Flame. But you're still giving Living Flame a chance because there are only 3 abilities in here, and you're going to be getting to it fairly often. Though there are times where it might hang for a split second, or it might use Living Flame when there's something else that you probably would rather it have used. So I'm not saying it can't happen either way, but for the most part, it seems to be pretty consistent. So with that being said, this is a loop of 4. 4 might be a little bit too high. I might lower that down to 2 or 3, but basically it's going to prioritize these 3 abilities in this loop, and after it does the pattern 4 times, it's going to break out of the loop, and then it's going to use Dragon Rage and Tip the Scales. So those are outside the macro because they both have longer cooldowns. Tip the Scales, I can put it anywhere I want, really. I just put it there because it's just easier to have it organized that way. It's an off cooldown ability, so that can just be used whenever. But the Dragon Rage has a much longer cooldown, and so we don't want to try to use it too often and hang the macro even more. So that's why it's on the outside with a fairly large loop number, repeat number added in. So basically the macro is going to go through this pattern 4 times. It's going to try to use Disintegrate, and then it's going to go back in and go through the pattern 4 more times and rinse and repeat, prioritizing the abilities at the top over the abilities at the bottom, and primarily what we're worried about is spending our essence and our essence burst over using our living flame filler ability. So yeah, it's a delicate balance. It's very hard to find the, you know, the balancing act there and trying to get that to work well, but this is what I've got so far. I think I will probably drop this down to 3 on both of these, and I think that will probably function better. But again, you know, feel free to edit these as you see fit, but like I said, this seems to be working pretty well. So let's go ahead and take a look at the AoE one, and you'll see it's going to be pretty much the exact same thing. I am going to change that loop down to 3, and you know what, actually no, I'm not, because for AoE the abilities are not, you know, cast, they're instant cast. And so Pyre is an instant cast, and also Azure Strike is also an instant cast. So 4 probably will be better because of that. So that's something that I should probably keep in mind. Okay, so either way, yeah, so Pyre replaces Disintegrate, and Azure Strike replaces Living Flame, and then of course Shattering Star is still there, and then at the bottom we have our cooldowns. So yeah, basically the macro functions the same way. You know, it's just that, you know, it's the AoE version. And also, if you're moving, you can switch over to the AoE version, and it'll work for when you're moving as well. So you've kind of got both of those, you know, for both of them for those. So, yeah, so you have one for single target, spending, building your essences, and using your cooldowns. And then you have one for AoE, same thing, building, spending your essences, and then using your cooldowns, managing, and then, you, of course, you manage your empowerment abilities on separate buttons, and that's how you'll get through. So, yeah, that's pretty much what the macros are going to do. Like I said, there are going to be times where maybe you're hitting essence cap, you've got essence burst charges, and they're not going off as quickly as you like because the macro is probably using Living Flame instead. That may happen from time to time, you know, and there may be also sometimes where the flip side happens, where it hangs for an extra second longer than it should before it uses Living Flame because it's going through the other abilities which are all on cooldown, or maybe you don't have enough essences. But in general, they're going to try to prioritize spending your essences as quickly as possible, using your cooldowns, and then using your filler abilities. Obviously, there are certain windows that would work best for using certain abilities, like, you know, when you use Dragon Rage and you use your essence abilities, it's going to extend the duration, but the macro is not going to hold off on Dragon Rage if your essence abilities aren't available, because it's just going to use Dragon Rage when it gets to it in the macro, and if it's available, it's going to use it. That's how that's going to work. So that's something to keep in mind as well. But in general, you know, you do have control over your essence abilities, and honestly, I mean, you know, we know, I mean, if you've watched any of my other ability or videos and you know how Gnome Sequencer works, then you know by now that it's kind of one of those things where, like, you're never going to perform as well with a Gnome Sequencer sequence, you know, than you would be if you were a skilled player playing your class the way you should play it, and, you know, understanding how to execute your rotation. So there's always going to be those, like, those, I guess, concessions that you have to make when you use a macro like this. But in general, unfortunately, I can't get everything into one button or even 2 buttons, but this will manage a lot of your rotation, hopefully making things a little bit easier. It's a pretty simple and straightforward class overall. It's not super difficult, but if you have a hard time managing a lot of different buttons, this will help you out a little bit and make it even more straightforward for you. So yeah, if you want to use these, feel free to import them into your game using Gnome Sequencer. Do not forget to hotkey them, it's very important. And if you do all that, let me know what you think about them in the comments below. And with all that being said, I will see you guys on the next one. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, let me know by clicking that like button. And feel free to share it with your friends so they can enjoy it as well. And if you'd like to see more videos, you can subscribe to the channel and click on the bell icon to be notified as soon as new videos are posted. You can also follow me on Facebook, and if you'd like, you can support my work on Patreon. Links to all that stuff can be found in the description below. This is TheKephas. Until next time.